The phone vibrated just as I pulled onto my daughter's street. The smell of the apple pie I baked for my granddaughter filling the car. It was my lawyer. "Don't go in there," he said, his voice grim. "Emily just filed the motion. She's trying to have you declared mentally incompetent. If you believe that betrayal from family is the deepest cut, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss how this story ends." The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled my car. A warm, sweet cloud that felt like pure happiness. It was the scent of my late wife Clara's recipe, one I'd finally mastered after years of trying. On the passenger seat, the apple pie sat in its carrier, its golden brown crust still radiating a gentle heat. I had baked it for my granddaughter, Chloe. At 7, she had a bottomless appetite for my baking, a fact that made my chest swell with a quiet sort of pride. I was on my way to my daughter Emily's house for our weekly Sunday dinner. It was a ritual I cherished, a small island of peace in a life that had always been defined by work. The streets of our Seattle suburb were familiar, lined with maple trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn. I smiled, thinking of Emily. I remembered teaching her to ride her bike on this very street, her small hands gripping the handlebars so tightly, her face a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "Don't let go, Dad," she'd shouted. And I never did. Everything I had ever built, every 60-hour work week, every sleepless night spent debugging code in my garage. 30 years ago, it was all for her. Hansen Tech wasn't just a company to me. It was a legacy, a kingdom I was building to one day place in her hands. That's when my phone buzzed in the center console. I glanced at the screen. It was my lawyer, David. A call from him on a Sunday evening was unusual. My stomach gave a little lurch. I tapped the screen to answer. The car's Bluetooth system, picking up the call. "Lester." "Good," you answered, he said. His voice was tight, stripped of its usual warmth. "Are you somewhere you can talk freely?" "I'm on my way to Emily's." "What's wrong?" "David, you sound serious." There was a pause on the other end, filled with a static that seemed to crackle with tension. "Lester, I need you to pull over. Right now." My heart started a low, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I did as he said, guiding the car to the curb, under the shade of a large oak tree. I turned down the radio. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine and my own breathing. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm parked. Tell me what's going on." "I got a notification from the courthouse an hour ago," David began, and his next words seemed to suck all the air out of the car. "A motion has been filed against you. Lester, it's from Emily." The world narrowed to the sound of his voice in my speakers. Emily. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. "What kind of motion?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. David took a deep breath. "She's petitioning the court to have you declared mentally incompetent to continue your duties as CEO of Hansen Tech." The cinnamon apple scent that had filled the car moments ago now seemed cloying, sickening. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, a feeling I hadn't known since the day I lost Clara. Incompetent, the word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of my mind. She, along with a small block of minority shareholders she's aligned with, are citing a pattern of emotional instability and erratic decision-making based on sentimentality rather than sound business judgment. David's voice was grim, professional. He was reading from a document my daughter had created. I couldn't form words. My hand, resting on the steering wheel, began to tremble. I stared at the perfect suburban houses, at the kids playing on their lawns. And it all felt like a movie set, fake and distant. My daughter, my little girl who I taught to ride a bike, who I was building a kingdom for. She was trying to destroy me. Lester, are you still there? Yes. I managed the word, a dry rasp. Yes. I'm here. Don't go to her house. David warned. Don't talk to her. We need to convene first thing in the morning to formulate a response. I'm forwarding you the documents now. It's extensive. I ended the call without another word. For a long time, I just sat there, the engine humming, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm. I looked at the apple pie on the seat next to me. A simple gift of love. Now it felt like a prop in a twisted play I never knew I was a part of. A cold resolve began to form amidst the chaos in my chest. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I needed to see her. I needed to look into her eyes and see for myself. I put the car back in drive and continued down the street to her house. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. Emily stood there, beaming, her blonde hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. She was beautiful, the spitting image of her mother. "Dad, you're here," she exclaimed, rushing forward to wrap me in a hug. Her arms felt warm, her embrace familiar, but as I hugged her back, all I could feel was a chilling emptiness. It was a perfect performance. I brought pie for Chloe. I said, holding it up, "You're the best. Dad, she'll be so excited." Emily took the pie from me and led me inside. The house was immaculate, filled with the aroma of roasting chicken. Her husband, Trevor, gave me a friendly wave from the living room. Everything was normal, horrifyingly normal. And then Chloe came running down the stairs, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Grandpa." She launched herself into my arms, and for a moment, the crushing weight on my chest lifted. I held her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. This was real. This love was real. "I have something for you," she said, squirming out of my arms and running to the small table in the entryway where she did her crafts. She came back holding a piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, stood in front of a building with Hansen Tech written across the top. The taller figure was holding the smaller one's hand. At the bottom, in shaky, 7-year-old letters, it read, "Grandpa is the best boss." A sharp, physical pain shot through my chest. I felt my smile freeze on my face. I had to swallow hard to keep my composure. I looked from the drawing to Emily, who was watching us with a soft, maternal smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's beautiful." "Sweetie," I said to Chloe, my voice thick, "I'm going to hang this in my office." At dinner, the conversation flowed easily, but I felt like I was watching it from behind a pane of glass. Emily was a masterful actress. She asked about my week, about my health. "Are you sleeping enough?" "Dad," she asked, her brow furrowed with what looked like genuine concern, "you've been working so hard. You need to make sure you're taking care of yourself." Every question was a dagger wrapped in silk. She wasn't asking out of love. She was gathering intelligence, building her case. I kept my answers short and non-committal, focusing on my food, which tasted like cardboard. Then, she steered the conversation toward work. "By the way," she said casually, taking a sip of wine, "I've been doing some restructuring with the project funds, just optimizing efficiency." You know, the Elena Initiative Development Fund. For example, it had some very loose operational bylaws. I've tightened them up, moved some assets around to maximize returns. She looked at me, expecting praise for her business acumen. The Elena Initiative. I had started that fund in her mother's name. A charitable wing of the company dedicated to funding women in tech. I had given Emily full control of it as a sign of my trust. A piece of her mother's legacy for her to steward. And now she was talking about it like it was just another column on a spreadsheet. I just nodded, a knot forming in my stomach. When it was time to leave, the goodbyes were just as practiced as the greetings. Emily gave me another hug at the door. Drive safe. Dad, I love you. The words hung in the air between us, hollow and meaningless. As I walked to my car, I felt her eyes on my back. I got in, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the doorway, still waving. And then, just as I turned the corner, I saw her hand drop and the warm smile vanish from her face, replaced by an expression that was cold, hard, and calculating. The drive home was a blur. The warmth of the family dinner had been replaced by an Arctic chill that seemed to seep into my bones. My house felt cavernous and empty when I walked in. I tossed my keys on the counter and went straight to my office. I sat down in my leather chair, the one that had molded to my shape over thousands of hours of work, and turned on my computer. My inbox was blinking. One new email. The sender was David. The subject line was simple, stark, and it made my blood run cold. It read, "It's worse than we thought. They've been preparing this for 6 months." I clicked open the attachment, 80 pages of legal jargon, sworn affidavits, and cherry-picked exhibits formed a grotesque caricature of my life's work. I didn't sleep that night. I read every single word. Each sentence a fresh wound. They twisted my loyalty into senility. My decision to keep a veteran engineer on the payroll through his cancer treatment was painted as fiscally irresponsible. My choice to partner with a local charity was described as a vanity project that neglected shareholder value. But the part that truly broke me, the part that made a hot, acidic anger rise in my throat, was their use of Clara. They had attached a psychologist report from a doctor I'd never met that speculated my grief over her death 5 years ago had led to a cognitive decline masked by routine. They used my love for my wife as a weapon against me. They were trying to pathologize my heart. The sun was a pale, watery gray when it finally rose. I hadn't moved from my chair. The shock from the night before had cooled and hardened into something else. A cold, heavy stone of resolve in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I drove to David's office downtown. His firm occupied the top floor of a glass and steel tower that looked out over the Puget Sound. The view was usually calming, but today the choppy, gray water only mirrored the storm inside me. David greeted me at the door to a large conference room. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. Waiting at the long, polished table was my oldest friend and Hansen Tech's co-founder, Frank. Frank was the engineering soul of the company. A brilliant, gruff man with a beard that was more salt than pepper. He stood up as I entered, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage. "Lester," he began, his voice a low rumble. I read the file David sent over. That little girl I used to buy ice cream for after her ballet recitals. "She's trying to do this to you." I just nodded, sinking into one of the plush chairs. David closed the door, shutting out the morning bustle of the office. "Frank is here as a friend. Lester, but also as a key witness to your character and competence. We need to understand their strategy. He laid it all out for us. Emily's legal team was building a narrative. Brick by ugly brick. They were constructing a story for the judge, a story about a beloved founder who had lost his edge, a man whose grief had clouded his judgment, making him a liability to the very company he had created. They had emails where I'd overruled Emily on cost-cutting measures, presenting them as proof of my emotional reasoning. They had clandestine notes from meetings where I'd championed long-term projects over short-term gains, twisting my vision into recklessness. "There's painting a masterpiece of deceit," David said, his knuckles white as he gripped a pen. "And they've been doing it for a long time." I looked at Frank, then at David. The tremors in my hands from the night before were gone. The hollow ache in my chest had been filled with a cold, clear purpose. The grief was still there, but now it was fuel. "She wants a war," I said, my voice low but steady. "She'll get one, but we will fight it with the truth. We will not use her tactics." David nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Good. That's the only way we win and keep our integrity. So, we start by building our own case. But I have to ask, is there anything in her own conduct we can use? Any weaknesses?" I flinched. The thought of digging into my own daughter's life for dirt made me feel ill. "No. He won't do it. We defend against her lies. We don't attack her character. This is about the company. Not personal revenge." Frank grunted in agreement. "Lester's right. We don't get in the mud with them." But Emily was already slinging it. The next afternoon, Frank called me, his voice tight with fury. "Turn on the financial news." I did, and there it was. A headline on a major business news site, "Uncertainty at Hansen Tech as leadership stability questioned." The article was filled with anonymous sources, insiders concerned about the company's direction, quoting phrases that sounded suspiciously like they were lifted directly from the lawsuit. Our stock ticker at the bottom of the screen showed a dip, a small one, but it was there. She was deliberately wounding the company to prove her point. We were back in David's office that evening. The offending article projected onto a large screen. "This is a calculated leak." David said, "She's trying to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Spook the market. Pressure the board." "It's Clara's birthday next month," I said quietly, almost to myself. We were supposed to announce the new recipients of the Elena Initiative scholarships. Frank's head snapped up. He looked at me, a thought dawning on his face. "The Elena Initiative, Lester. You gave Emily complete autonomy over that fund. Didn't you? Said you wanted her to have a personal connection to her mother's legacy?" I did. I confirmed. The bylaws were intentionally loose. I wanted her to have the freedom to do good with it as she saw fit. It was a matter of trust. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication of my words settled. A fund with loose oversight. A matter of trust. A trust that had been utterly shattered. A new, terrible possibility began to take shape in my mind. It was a dark, ugly thought. One I didn't want to entertain. But it was there. Persistent and cold. David saw the look on my face. His lawyer's mind was already connecting the dots. "Frank, can you get us the complete financials for that fund? Every transaction for the last year." "Already on it," Frank said, pulling out his laptop. "I'm the system architect. There's no door in that company I can't open. It'll just take some time to do it without leaving a trace." That night, David made a call. He hired a forensic accountant, a specialist in finding needles in financial haystacks, while Frank worked in the dead of night, pulling data from our own servers. Our new ally would be ready to analyze it. We were no longer just defending. We were investigating. A few days later, I called a board meeting. I knew Emily would have ears everywhere. So, I gave them something to hear. I acted the part she had written for me. I raised my voice about the article leak. I appeared flustered, emotional, letting a carefully crafted image of instability slip through. I saw the look of smug satisfaction exchanged between two of the junior board members I knew were in her camp. They thought they were seeing the cracks appear. They had no idea I was laying a trap. The real work was happening in the background. In the quiet hum of Frank's computer and the meticulous analysis of the accountant, a week went by. A week of living a double life. By day, I was the supposedly faltering CEO. By night, I was part of a war council, poring over spreadsheets and timelines. Then came the call. It was late on a Friday night. I was in my study, looking at an old photo of Clara and a 10-year-old Emily, their faces bright with laughter. My phone rang. It was David. "Lester, are you sitting down?" he asked. His voice was different. It was calm, but with a sharp, lethal edge. "I am now," I said. "Our accountant found it," David said, and I could hear the rustle of papers. "It's a single transaction from 6 months ago. A payment for $847,000 from the Elena Initiative fund." My breath hitched. "To who?" There was a long pause. "It was wired to a shell corporation, a consulting firm I've never heard of." But he did some digging. He found out who the sole proprietor of that consulting firm is. "Lester, you're not going to believe this." The weeks leading up to the competency hearing were the longest of my life. The piece of information about the Shell Corporation was a loaded gun, and David kept it locked away, convinced that its impact would be greatest if fired at the last possible moment. We spent our days preparing for a conventional defense, while the nights were spent fine-tuning the ambush. On the morning of the hearing, I stood before my closet, the rows of familiar suits feeling like a stranger's wardrobe. I chose a simple charcoal gray one. It felt like armor. The courtroom was even more intimidating than I had imagined. A cathedral of law built from dark wood and cold, unforgiving marble. The air was thick with the scent of old books and heavy silence. I took my seat at the defendant's table, David placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Across the aisle, I saw Emily. She was sitting next to her lawyer, Jessica Vance, a woman who radiated a chilling, predatory confidence. Vance whispered something in Emily's ear, and my daughter nodded. Her expression unreadable. She refused to meet my eyes. I wasn't just a stranger to her. I was the opposition. The proceedings began, and Jessica Vance rose to address the court. Her voice, smooth as polished glass, filled the room. "Your Honor," she began, "we are here today, not out of malice, but out of a profound and painful sense of duty. We are here to discuss the legacy of a titan, a pioneer of his industry, Mr. Lester Hansen." She gestured towards me, not with accusation, but with a display of deep, theatrical sorrow. A lion in winter, but even lions grow old. A legacy, if not properly stewarded, risks consuming its creator. She spoke for 20 minutes, weaving a masterful narrative of a brilliant mind in decline. She twisted my 30 years of leadership into a cautionary tale. She painted me as King Lear, raging against the storm of his own obsolescence. unable to distinguish friend from foe, prudence from paranoia. It was sickening. It was brilliant. I felt the eyes of the people in the gallery on me, filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Then, she began her assault. The plaintiff calls Mr. Mark Jennings to the stand. I knew Mark. I had hired him 15 years ago. I'd also had to let him go 8 months prior. He was a decent manager who had simply become complacent, resistant to the innovations the company needed to survive. I had given him a generous severance package and wished him well. Now, he was walking to the stand to testify against me. Vance led him through a series of questions, constructing a scene from a board meeting. Mr. Jennings, she purred. Can you describe the atmosphere during the Q3 budget review last year? Mark cleared his throat. It was tense. Mr. Hansen was very agitated. He'd been delaying a necessary round of layoffs for months. When I presented the data showing the financial drain, Well? He snapped. He started shouting, saying the numbers didn't tell the whole story, that people weren't just figures on a spreadsheet. So, he became enraged, Vance pressed. Terrifyingly so. Mark agreed. It was an uncontrolled rage. We all felt like we were walking on eggshells. I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. I remembered that day clearly. I had been passionate. Yes, I had argued fiercely that we should try to reassign those employees before laying them off. I had raised my voice, not in rage, but in frustration at our lack of imagination, but there was no terrifying rage. He was lying. Or rather, he was telling a version of the truth, so warped it had become a lie. And then, Vance called her star witness. The plaintiff calls Emily Hansen. My daughter rose and moved to the stand with a practiced grace, dressed in a somber navy suit. She looked every bit the reluctant, grieving daughter. She swore the oath, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the floor. Vance's questioning began gently. Miss Hansen, can you tell the court what led you to make this incredibly difficult decision? Emily took a carefully timed breath, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I love my father, she said, her voice trembling artfully, which is why it pains me to say that he is no longer the man he once was. She proceeded to build on Vance's foundation, adding personal, intimate details that made the betrayal feel 1,000 times sharper. She spoke of a time I had missed her 5th grade school play because of a server crisis that nearly bankrupted the company. She presented it not as a necessary sacrifice, but as the first sign of my emotional detachment, my growing forgetfulness. He didn't even remember promising to be there, she said, her voice thick with manufactured pain. It was as if it never happened. That was the first time I realized he was starting to lose pieces of himself. It was our turn. David cross-examined her, his approach calm and methodical. Miss Hansen, he asked. That school play, that was the night of the Phoenix server crash. Was it not? The one that would have erased all our client data? Emily hesitated. Yes. But, and it was your father, working for 48 hours straight with the engineering team, who personally saved the company from utter ruin. He was the CEO. That was his job, she said defensively. Indeed, David said softly. No further questions. He had planted a seed. Then it was my turn to take the stand. The walk felt like crossing a barren desert. I swore the oath, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I sat down and finally, I met Emily's Hase. There was no love there. No pain. Only cold. Hard ambition. Vance's cross-examination was a masterclass in cruelty. She circled me. Her questions like jabs. Looking for an opening, she brought up the engineer with cancer. She brought up the charity donations. Then, she delivered the killing blow she had been saving. "Mr. Hansen," she said, her voice suddenly soft. "Conspiratorial. Isn't it true that you sometimes speak to your late wife? Clara, when you're alone in your office..." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was a vile, despicable question, designed to paint me as a senile old man talking to ghosts. The anger that surged through me was so hot, so powerful. I felt it might actually incinerate me. This was the moment. They expected me to erupt. I took a deep breath, picturing Clara's smile. I looked not at Vance, but at the judge. "I speak to my wife's memory," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying through the silent room. "I find that her memory reminds me of what's important: integrity, kindness, and telling the truth. It's a practice you might find beneficial, Miss Vance." The comeback landed. Vance's smirk faltered for a second. When she was finished, I felt like I had gone 15 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. But I was still standing. David rose. "The defense calls no further witnesses, Your Honor. Instead, we would like to present evidence." He started with the psychiatric evaluations. 3 unimpeachable reports that methodically dismantled their primary claim. He moved on to the company's financials. The charts showing a 12% profit increase and a 94% employee retention rate glowing on the courtroom screens. The foundation of their case was turning to sand. I saw Emily shifting in her seat, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "And now, Your Honor," David announced, his voice dropping, pulling the entire room into a state of suspended animation. "The defense would like to call its final witness. We call Mr. Arthur Finch, a nondescript man in a gray suit, our forensic accountant." Walked to the stand. The tension in the room was so thick I could feel it pressing on my skin. David established Finch's credentials. Then began the slow, methodical dissection. "Mr. Finch, in your audit of Hansen Tech's funds, did you notice any irregularities?" "I did," Finch said, his voice the epitome of calm professionalism. "Specifically, within the Elena Initiative Development Fund." At the mention of her mother's name, Emily's posture became rigid. "Can you describe this irregularity?" David asked. Finch adjusted his glasses. 6 months ago, a single wire transfer was made from the fund for the sum of $847,000. A murmur spread through the gallery. That was a substantial amount of money. And to what kind of entity was this sum transferred? "To a limited liability consulting company," Finch answered. "Did this LLC provide any consulting services to the Elena Initiative? Are there any reports, invoices, or deliverables on file?" "None that I could find in the company records," Finch stated. "What is the name of this consulting firm?" David asked, his voice steady. "It is called Vance Strategic Consulting, LLC." A collective gasp. Jessica Vance shot to her feet. "Objection relevance. This is a smear tactic. It will become highly relevant in a moment." "Your Honor," David promised. The judge, his eyes narrowed and fixed on Vance, overruled the objection. Vance sank back into her chair. Her mask of confidence shattered, her face pale. David turned back to Finch. The trap was sprung. Now it was time to close it. Mr. Finch, for the court's final clarification, were you able to determine the ownership of this? Vance Strategic Consulting. I was, Finch said. It is a single-member LLC. The sole proprietor is registered with the state. The room was utterly silent. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. And could you please tell the court, David said, his voice ringing with the cold, clear finality of a bell tolling, the name of that sole proprietor. Finch looked directly at the judge. The owner is Miss Jessica Vance. The word ignited the room. It was pandemonium. Jessica Vance was on her feet, shouting, her face a mask of fury and panic. But no one was looking at her. Everyone, including me, was looking at Emily. Her face had drained of all color. Her mouth was open in a silent scream of disbelief and horror. The web of deceit had just collapsed, and she was tangled in the wreckage. She had been caught red-handed. She had embezzled money from a charity honoring her dead mother to pay the lawyer she hired to destroy her living father. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming for order. When a semblance of quiet was restored, his gaze fell on me. Mr. Hansen, do you wish to make a statement? I rose slowly, my legs feeling surprisingly strong. I didn't look at the judge or the jury of public opinion in the gallery. I looked only at my daughter. Her eyes, wide with panic and shame, were finally locked on mine. This money was meant to honor your mother's memory. Emily, I said, my voice heavy, not with anger, but with a sorrow so profound it felt like it was being dredged up from the center of the earth. She believed in building things, in helping people. You used her memory to try and erase mine. That was it. That was the final blow. A sound tore from her throat. Araf. Animal noise of absolute despair that had nothing to do with her earlier performance. It was the sound of a soul breaking. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hand, her body convulsing with uncontrollable, racking sobs that filled the stunned silence of the courtroom. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world crashing down into absolute ruin. The judge stared at the scene. His expression, a mixture of pity and disgust. He banged his gavel one last time, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. This court is in recess until a final ruling can be made. But no one was listening to him. All eyes were on my daughter, my only child, as she completely and utterly fell apart. The recess felt like an eternity compressed into an hour. The courtroom emptied, leaving a vacuum of echoing silence. Emily was guided out by her husband, Trevor, who held her up as she stumbled, her face buried in his shoulder. Before disappearing through the doors, he shot a look over his shoulder at me, a look of pure, undiluted venom. David and Frank were at my side instantly, their hands on my back, their faces lit with the fierce joy of victory. Frank was ecstatic, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. David was more contained, a sharp, satisfied glint in his eye that spoke of a job well done. We did it. Lester, David said, his voice a low, triumphant hum. We destroyed them. But I felt nothing of the sort. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sweet satisfaction of justice served. As I stared at the empty chair where my daughter had sat, all I felt was a profound, hollowing emptiness. The victory was a technicality. The war had been won. But the battlefield was my own family, and the casualties were devastating. The image of Emily's brokenness was seared into my mind. a brand of failure that no court ruling could ever erase. When we were called back in, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was gone, replaced by a somber finality. Emily and Trevor were already at their table. She sat perfectly still, her eyes red-rimmed and staring at a fixed point on the polished wood, her face a pale, blank mask of shock. The judge entered, his expression grim. He took his seat and wasted no time. After reviewing the evidence presented, he began, his voice a stern, formal pronouncement. This court finds the petition against Mr. Lester Hansen to be entirely without merit. In fact, it appears to be a malicious and fraudulent attempt to usurp control of a company through deceit. He looked directly at Emily and Jessica Vance, who seemed to have shrunk in her expensive suit. The petition is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Hansen retains full and unequivocal control of Hansen Tech. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court will be forwarding the evidence of financial misconduct to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation into potential embezzlement and fraud. And Miss Vance, he said, his eyes like chips of ice, I will be personally filing a complaint with the State Bar. You are a disgrace to your profession. The gavel came down with a final, booming crack. It was over. I had won. Frank let out a whoop of joy beside me, but I barely heard him. I watched as Trevor helped a seemingly catatonic Emily to her feet and led her from the courtroom. My daughter, who was now facing a criminal investigation. My victory tasted like ashes. The days that followed were a disorienting fog. Frank and I worked tirelessly to calm the waters at Hansen Tech, issuing statements, reassuring investors, and holding all-hands meetings. The board members who had sided with Emily offered their resignations, which I accepted without comment. The company, the machine I had built, slowly returned to its rhythm, but I felt like a ghost haunting its halls. At night, the silence of my large, empty house was deafening. I found myself wandering into Emily's old bedroom, a perfect time capsule of her teenage years. I'd run my hand over the spine of her favorite books, look at the faded photos of her and her friends, and ask the empty room, where did I go wrong? I'd pull out old photo albums, searching for a clue in the smiling faces of the past. There was Emily on my shoulders at a 4th of July parade, Chloe taking her first steps in my living room. All of it felt like a life that belonged to someone else. What had I been so busy building that I had failed to see the cracks forming in my own foundation? A week after the verdict, I knew I couldn't continue like this. The anger had faded, leaving only a deep, aching grief. I drove to Lake Union, a place overflowing with memories. I parked near the old boathouse where Clara and I used to watch the seaplanes. The water was calm, a vast sheet of gray reflecting the overcast sky. I pulled out my phone and typed a simple, terrifying message to Emily. I'm at the lake, the spot by the old boathouse. If you want to talk. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. I didn't expect a reply, but I had to try. I waited, watching the water, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 40. I was about to give up, to accept that some things were too broken to fix, when I saw a figure walking slowly along the path. It was her, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater. She looked younger, smaller, and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. She stopped about 10 feet away, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, refusing to look at me. We stood in that heavy silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds, the lapping of the water and the distant cry of a gull. Why, I finally asked, the word barely a whisper, but it felt as loud as a shout in the stillness. Why did you do it? Emily. Her shoulders began to shake. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were swimming with tears. Because I never thought you saw me, she said. Her voice choked and raw. I spent my entire life on a treadmill, running as fast as I could, thinking that if I just got the next A, the next promotion, the next success, you'd finally look up from your work and see me. Not just your daughter, not just your future CEO. Me. She took a ragged breath, but it never happened. I got my MBA from Stanford, and you said, "Good. That will be useful." I closed the biggest deal in the company's history, and you said, "Don't get complacent." I felt like a ghost in my own life. I thought if I took the company, if I ripped it out of your hands, it would be the one thing you couldn't ignore. You would finally have to see me. It was never about the money, Dad. It was about being seen. Her confession was a physical blow. All those years, I thought I was building a future for her. She experienced it as me building a wall between us. My ambition, my dedication, my love. It had all been filtered through the lens of her pain and perceived as neglect. "I'm so sorry, Emily," I said, the words feeling pitifully small. I was so focused on giving you everything I never had, I forgot to give you the one thing you needed. Me. I'm so sorry. We talked for hours as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. She spoke of her deep-seated loneliness, of the resentment that had festered into a monstrous plan. I spoke of my guilt over Clara, of how I'd buried my grief in work and, in doing so, had buried my relationship with my own daughter. We laid our broken pieces out on the park bench between us. It was ugly, and it was painful, but for the first time in years, it was honest. A dusk settled. A thought that had been a faint whisper in my mind grew into a clear, albeit terrifying, idea. It was a risk, perhaps the biggest of my life. "I have a proposal for you," I said into the twilight. She looked at me, her expression wary. "I want you to be my co-CEO." She stared, speechless. "What, Dad? After everything I did, I tried to destroy you. I'm facing a criminal investigation. I've spoken with the DA," I said gently. "With your full cooperation and repayment to the fund, they've agreed to reduce it to a civil penalty and community service. As for the rest, Hansen Tech needs to evolve. It needs my experience. But it also needs your vision. It needs new ideas. We can't go back to the way things were. But maybe," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "we can build something new. Together." Her first reaction was suspicion. "Is this pity? Are you trying to fix this with a job title?" "No," I said firmly. "This is a business decision. And a family one. Your strategy, however twisted the execution was, came from a real place. You see things I don't. I need that. And you need a mentor who sees you. We can be that for each other." It wasn't an easy path. It took weeks of long, difficult conversations, many of them mediated by a family therapist. We yelled, we cried, we slowly, painstakingly, began to listen. We drafted a new partnership agreement from scratch, one with ironclad boundaries and shared responsibilities. We made a pact. Family dinners were sacred. No phones. No business talk. Not ever again. The story ends, as it began, with a Sunday dinner. I walked up to Emily's front door, the familiar scent of roasting chicken in the air. This time, when Trevor opened the door, the venom was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, hesitant respect. He shook my hand firmly. Chloe came running, launching herself into my arms. "Grandpa." She handed me a new drawing. This time, there were 3 stick figures in front of the Hansen Tech building. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. All of them were holding hands. Emily came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She smiled at me. It wasn't the perfect, polished smile from before. This one was real, a little fragile around the edges. But it reached her eyes, and they shone with a light I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. "The pie smells amazing. Dad, it's your mother's recipe," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I no longer had to hide. We sat down to eat, not as a CEO and his subordinate, not as a victor and the vanquished, but as a family, a broken, scarred, but healing family. We hadn't just saved a company. We were saving each other. And in that quiet, unassuming dining room, filled with the warmth of forgiveness, we were finally building the legacy Clara had always wanted for us.